Let us know how women were tortured thousands of years ago and why they were killed alive. In the earliest breath of human civilization, when language was still forming and fire was a godly miracle, the roles assigned were not written, but carved into behavior, and those carvings became the invisible rules that would shape generations to come. The world was raw and untamed, and in this wildness, power was often drawn not from wisdom or kindness, but from strength and fear. As tribes formed, territories grew, and with them, the desire to dominate not just over land and beasts, but over one another. In this battle of assertion, the ones who bore life, who nurtured the tribe's future within their bodies, were slowly turned into symbols sacred yet subjugated, revered yet restrained. In these primitive communities, the ability to give birth became both a blessing and a burden. What was once admired as magical became a reason to control. As societies became more organized, they were structured to protect property and lineage. Bloodlines became essential, and so, to ensure paternity, the autonomy of women was gradually and forcefully taken. Their bodies were not their own, but instruments of legacy, honor, and transaction. The role of the mother was honored only within the framework of submission. She was to serve, to birth, to obey. With the rise of agriculture came surplus, and with surplus came the concept of wealth. Ownership became the currency of power, and in this surge of possessions, women were counted alongside livestock and land. Marriages became arrangements not of love, but of alliance. Girls, barely past childhood, were traded in exchange for peace, cattle, or territory. Once handed over, they lost not only their family, but their voice. Their worth was weighed in dowries and obedience. Speaking against this fate was rebellion, and rebellion was punishable by beating, exile, or worse. Temples and gods rose from the dust of these civilizations. With divinity came scripture, and with scripture came law. In many cultures, divine stories mirrored the power dynamics of men and women. Male gods ruled the skies, the oceans, and war. Female deities were often consort, symbols of fertility, or destroyers when enraged. This mythologizing reinforced a hierarchy that even in the heavens, the woman served a function, not a freedom. This seeped into daily life. Women were forbidden from entering sacred spaces during certain times of the month, not because of impurity in truth, but because their power to bleed without death unsettled men and had to be framed as contamination. Time moved forward, empires grew and fell, but the condition of women, for the most part, remained anchored in subjugation. In many ancient cities, if a woman was found walking alone at night, she was deemed a temptress. If she was assaulted, she was blamed. Her honor was tied to her silence. If she spoke of pain, she brought shame to her house. Justice was a tale rarely written for her. Testimonies of women held no weight in many courts. Her body could be examined, judged, mutilated, and discarded often without consequence to her violator. The birth of a girl was often met not with celebration, but sorrow. In some regions, infants were drowned in rivers or buried alive, their tiny cries silenced beneath the weight of societal disdain. The preference for sons was not just cultural, it was economic. Sons carried names, inherited land, performed last rites. Daughters were seen as burdens, destined to drain the family through dowry and marriage. Thus, from the very moment of existence, a woman had to justify her right to live. Education was a realm guarded fiercely by the male order. In most ancient societies, the reading of sacred texts, philosophy, or science was forbidden to women. Knowledge was power, and power was a threat when held by those expected to serve. Even when a few broke through the barriers and became poets, scholars, or healers, they were anomalies, sometimes revered in life, but more often forgotten or misrepresented in death. Their works, if preserved, were credited to male mentors or buried beneath layers of reinterpretation. In matters of law and governance, the voice of a woman was considered hysterical, unreliable, or sinful. In many ancient systems, a man could divorce or abandon his wife on suspicion alone, but a woman had to prove unbearable hardship to even be heard. Adultery, when committed by a man, was often overlooked, but when suspected in a woman, it was punishable by stoning, burning, or public humiliation. Her body was used as a canvas to etch punishment, as if her pain could cleanse the dishonor of her existence. Physical beauty was commodified even in the most ancient times. Carvings on temple walls, inscriptions in royal chambers, and early medical texts show the obsession with the female form. Standards were defined by patriarchal aesthetics, and failure to meet them led to mockery or isolation. Women were forced to bind their feet, paint their skin, alter their diets, and mutilate their bodies to fit into molds shaped not by desire but by dominance. In war, the suffering of women reached unspeakable depths. When kingdoms clashed, it was women who bore the deepest scars. Victorious armies considered the conquered women as spoils. Mass rapes were not just acts of violence, but tools of psychological warfare. Women were paraded naked in streets, branded with the insignia of conquerors, forced to bear the children of their captors. Their trauma was generational, but their stories were often erased, for no empire wants its glory to be shadowed by the suffering of those it trampled. Even within the household, a supposed sanctuary, women were seldom safe. They were expected to wake before all, sleep after all, eat after all, and speak only when spoken to. If a man raised his hand against her, it was considered discipline. If she fought back, it was defiance. Stories abound of wives burned alive under the pretense of accidents or honor, of mothers thrown out after birthing daughters, of widows forced to immolate themselves on the pyres of their husbands. These were not exceptions, they were normalized, ritualized as sanctified. The suffering of women was compounded by their invisibility in historical narratives. Chroniclers, mostly men, recorded wars, coronations, and treaties, but ignored the silent rebellions and daily courage of women. The washerwoman who hid messages in laundry for rebels, the midwife who preserved knowledge through herbs, the mother who taught her daughters in secret. These lives were lived in shadows, their legacies carried only in whispers. Yet, amidst all this suffering, women endured. They found ways to resist, however subtle. They sang songs that carried pain disguised as lullabies. They embroidered cloth with symbols of protest. They passed down wisdom through stories and rituals. Even within oppressive temples, some priestesses carved out authority. Some queens ruled with iron resolve, veiling their strategies behind the guise of submission. In every age, there were those who refused to break, who became fire within the cage, refusing to be extinguished. But for every woman who found a sliver of autonomy, there were countless others who never even knew what freedom meant. They died nameless, voiceless, their stories buried beneath layers of dust and indifference. Their suffering was not personal, but systemic, embedded in the very structure of the world around them. And so, for thousands of years, the weight of injustice pressed against the souls of women. Every law written, every ritual enacted, every custom followed, it was like a thread tightening around their throats. The world had chosen to define them, not by who they were, but by how well they could endure. They were expected to absorb pain, hide tears, and smile through torment. They were the backbone of families, yet treated as disposable. They were the life givers, yet denied the right to shape their own. This long, unbroken lineage of suffering is not just history. It is the reason why every act of rebellion by a woman, every refusal to conform, every voice that rises today echoes with the cries of the past. It is why her courage is sacred. For she does not just fight for herself. She fights for those who could not, who were silenced, burned, broken, buried. And perhaps, in remembering the suffering and telling these stories without names or faces, the world can begin to listen. Not just to the sound of her voice, but to the silence she was once forced to live in. Thanks for watching. Please share this video.